Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hello, my dear friends. Tonight we begin with the strange, often funny, and occasionally absurd rules of medieval castles. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk into the great hall of a medieval castle, thinking you've made it. Warm fire, long wooden tables, food that looks vaguely edible, people dressed like they've been preparing for this moment since birth. For a brief second, you relax and think, this isn't so bad. That's your first mistake. Because the first thing you need to understand is this. You are not here to enjoy yourself. You are here to survive a very complicated social system disguised as dinner, and the fastest way to fail that system is to sit down. Now in your world, chairs are simple. You see one, you sit on it. Maybe you even pick strategically. Closer to the fire, better lighting, fewer people judging you. In a medieval castle, that exact same decision turns into a high-stakes gamble with your dignity and possibly your safety. Because seating is not random. It's a perfectly organized hierarchy that everyone understands except you, who just walked in thinking this was a casual event. At the far end of the hall sits the Lord, elevated, centered, the human equivalent of a do-not-touch sign. Next to him is family, then high nobles, then less important nobles, then knights, then guests, then servants, and then there's you, somewhere between background character and why is he here? But you don't know that. So you walk in, scan the room, and your brain, trained by modern logic, goes, that seat looks available. I will take it, which is exactly what you do. And immediately, everything changes. It's subtle at first. A pause, a glance, someone mid-bite just stops chewing. Conversations don't end, they just lose energy. Like the room itself is quietly processing your decision. Because you didn't just sit, you made a statement. A very bold, very incorrect statement. You've just placed yourself above someone who outranks you, which in medieval terms is not just rude, it's borderline offensive, possibly suspicious, and definitely memorable. And worst of all, you did it publicly. Now the person you just outranked has a problem. If they ignore you, they lose status. If they correct you, they regain it. And people with power love regaining things. So, best case scenario, a servant rushes over and gently relocates you before this becomes a story people tell later. Worst case, you've just embarrassed someone who owns both land and men with swords, which is not a great combination for your long-term plans. And here's the part that really hurts. No one thinks you made a mistake. They think you meant it, that you walked in, saw the hierarchy, and thought, yes, I belong up there. Which is an incredible level of confidence for someone who 5 minutes ago didn't even know where the door was. So you stand up quickly, awkwardly, possibly escorted, realizing that in this world, chairs are not furniture. They are power, and you just accidentally tried to steal some. So, you've survived the seating situation. Barely. You've been relocated to a safer, less controversial part of the table, somewhere between socially acceptable and completely forgettable, which, at this point, feels like a victory. Naturally, this gives you confidence, which is your next mistake, because now you think, okay, just don't sit wrong again and everything will be fine. And then you open your mouth. In a medieval castle, speaking is not something you just do. It's something you are allowed to do. There's a difference. Conversation here follows the same rules as seating, strict, invisible, and absolutely not explained to you. Nobles speak first. Important people speak more. Everyone else listens, nods, and exists quietly, like background furniture that occasionally breathes. And you are not high on the speaking list. But maybe you forget. Maybe someone says something interesting. Maybe there's a pause in conversation, and your brain, again using modern logic, goes, my time to contribute. So you do. You say something harmless, a comment, a joke, an observation, Something that in your world would be completely normal. And immediately the room goes quiet. Not loud quiet, not dramatic quiet, just that very specific uncomfortable silence where everyone suddenly becomes extremely aware that something has gone wrong. And that something is you, because you didn't just speak, you spoke without permission, which in a place built entirely on hierarchy is not seen as confidence. It's seen as overstepping. You've just inserted yourself into a conversation that wasn't yours. You've drawn attention without earning it. And worse, you've done it in front of people who measure status very carefully. Now everyone is looking at you, not with curiosity, with evaluation. Who are you? Why are you speaking? Who allowed this? And most importantly, should this be corrected? Because correction in this world is not always verbal. Best case scenario, someone higher ranked politely ignores you, which is actually a signal for you to stop existing conversationally. Slightly worse case, you get a sharp look or a cold response that quietly reminds you of your place. Worst case, you've just interrupted someone important, which means you're no longer just out of place. You're disrespectful and disrespectful and disrespectful and disrespectful quickly. So, you learn very quickly. You don't fill silences. You don't add thoughts. You don't join in, you wait. You exist. You speak only when spoken to. Because in this world, silence isn't awkward. It's safe. And right now, safe is exactly what you need. At this point, you've learned two important lessons. Don't sit where you want. Don't speak when you want. So naturally, you assume the safest strategy is simple. Just exist quietly. Don't move too much. Don't draw attention. Maybe eat something slowly and mind your business. And honestly, that's not a bad plan until your hand does something completely normal. It reaches maybe for a cup, maybe for a piece of bread, maybe for something on the table that looks like it has absolutely no consequences attached to it. And that's when you realize you've made another mistake. Because in a medieval castle, nothing is just there. Everything belongs to someone. That goblet owned. That plate owned. That knife definitely owned and possibly very meaningful to the person who owns it. And that piece of bread you just casually grabbed, also not yours, which means what you just did wasn't taking food. It was taking something that belonged to someone else. And in this world, ownership is not flexible. It's absolute. Objects are not just objects. They represent status, wealth, and identity. They are extensions of the person who owns them. So, when you touch them without permission, you're not just being careless. You're crossing a line. And like everything else in this castle, people notice. Not dramatically. No one jumps up and points at you. It's worse than that. It's subtle. A glance, a pause, someone slightly turning their head. The person sitting near you becoming very aware of your hand and what it's doing, because now there's a question in the air. Did you mean to do that? And if you did, why? Because again, no one assumes ignorance. They assume intent. Maybe you're disrespectful. Maybe you're testing boundaries. Maybe you're someone who doesn't understand their place. None of those are good options. Best case scenario, someone quietly corrects you. Maybe a servant replaces the item. Maybe you're gently told not to touch what isn't yours. Worst case, you've just taken something belonging to someone with power, pride, and absolutely no interest in explaining things to you. Which means your small, harmless action has just turned into something much bigger, a sign of disrespect. And in a castle, disrespect is rarely ignored. So, you pull your hand back slowly, carefully, like someone who has just realized that even the most basic movements require strategy. Because here nothing is casual. Not sitting, not speaking, not even reaching for food. And if you're going to survive, your hands need to learn discipline too. By now, you've accepted something important. By now, you've accepted something important. You are not here to enjoy the meal. You are here to survive it. Because somehow, despite your best efforts, even eating, yes, eating has rules. Not simple rules, not don't chew loudly rules. No, these are layered, silent, highly judgmental rules that everyone follows, except you, who is currently holding a piece of bread like it might explode. Because here's the problem. You don't know when to start. In a medieval castle, You don't just eat when food appears. You wait for the Lord for the signal, for that invisible moment when everyone collectively agrees, now we may consume. If you start too early, you're impatient. If you hesitate too long, you look confused. If you stare at the food like you're solving a puzzle, you look suspicious. There is no correct timing, only less dangerous timing. And then comes the technique. You don't grab. You don't reach across. You don't take the best portion, unless you're important enough to do so. Which, let's be honest, you are not. You take what is near you, carefully, modestly. Like someone who fully understands that their continued existence depends on not being noticed. And then there's the hand. Yes, the hand. Use the wrong one, and suddenly you've revealed yourself as uncultured. Medieval dining had expectations often involving which hand you used for eating, and which hand you absolutely did not, unless you wanted to broadcast information about your hygiene choices. So now you're thinking about your hands, which is not something you expected to do this much today. Then there's quantity. Eat too much, greedy. Eat too little, suspicious. Eat too fast, uncivilized. Eat too slow, strange. At this point, eating feels less like nourishment and more like a performance review, and everyone is watching. Not obviously, but enough. Because in a castle, how you eat says something about who you are, your discipline, your upbringing, your respect for order. And if what it says is wrong, people notice. And once again, the consequences aren't immediate. They're worse. They're remembered. So you choose slowly, carefully. Trying to look like someone who absolutely knows what they're doing, even though internally you're just hoping to make it through the meal without accidentally offending someone over a piece of bread. Because here, even dinner is dangerous. By now, you've mastered the basics of survival. You sit where you're told. You speak when necessary. You touch nothing. You eat like your life depends on it. So, naturally, you assume the hardest part is over. It isn't because now you have to deal with your eyes, which, unfortunately, you cannot turn off. In a medieval castle, looking is not neutral. Looking is communication. And like everything else, say here, there are rules, very specific rules that no one explains to you. So, you do what feels normal. You look around at the hall, the decorations, the people, the lord sitting at the high table, surrounded by wealth, power, and the kind of confidence that suggests he hasn't worried about seating arrangements in years. And that's when the problem begins, because you look a little too long. Not intentionally, just enough. And suddenly, what was harmless curiosity becomes something else. Attention. And attention in this setting is dangerous because if you look too little, you seem nervous, weak, uncertain, like someone who doesn't belong. But if you look too much, especially at someone important, you're no longer just observing, you're staring. And staring, depending on who you're looking at, can be interpreted as many things. Interest, challenge, disrespect, none of which you can afford. So now you're stuck in a very uncomfortable balancing act. Look just enough to appear aware, but not enough to be noticed, which is, of course, impossible. Because the moment you start thinking about where to look, you immediately start looking wrong. You glance at a noble. Too long, you quickly look away. Too fast. Now you seem suspicious. You tried to focus on your plate, but now you look disconnected. You look up again. Someone catches your eye, and now you're locked in the worst possible situation. Eye contact. Because eye contact, especially with someone above your rank, is not casual. It's loaded. Hold it too long and it feels like a challenge. Break it too quickly and you seem afraid. And both of those send signals you don't want to send. So, you do what anyone in your position would do. You pretend to be very interested in something completely harmless. The table, the food, that one piece of bread you've been slowly eating for the past 10 minutes. Anything that doesn't involve a debt. Identically challenging someone who could ruin your day without standing up. Because in this world, even your eyes need discipline. And the difference between a glance and a problem is about half a second. At this point, you're starting to feel experienced. You've survived sitting, speaking, eating, even looking, which somehow required more strategy than you expected from your own eyes. So naturally, you assume movement will be simple. You stand up, you leave the table, you walk away. easy, except it isn't. Because in a medieval castle, how you leave a space matters just as much as how you enter it. And the worst thing you can do, turn your back. Now, in your world, turning your back is normal. You finish a conversation, you turn, you go. No one thinks twice about it. In a castle, turning your back, especially on someone of higher rank, is not just casual movement. It's a statement, and not a good one. Because turning your back can be interpreted as dismissal, as if you've decided the person in front of you is no longer worth your attention. And if that person happens to be powerful, you've just made a very bold, very unwise decision. So now, instead of walking away like a normal human being, you have to leave carefully. You step back slightly. You lower your gaze. Not too much, not too little. You angle your body just enough to show respect, but not enough to look like you're trying too hard. And then you begin the slow, awkward process of exiting, without fully turning your back, which, if you're imagining it, looks exactly as uncomfortable as it feels. Because it is. You're essentially trying to walk away while still acknowledging someone behind you, which goes against everything your body naturally wants to do. And of course, you're doing all of this while being watched, because people notice how you leave, just like they noticed how you sat, how you spoke, how you ate. Everything here is observed, evaluated, remembered. So if you turn too quickly, disrespectful. If you hesitate too long, awkward. If you stumble while trying to maintain this strange half-facing posture, unforgettable, and not in a good way. So you move slowly, deliberately, like someone who understands that even walking away has consequences. Because in a medieval castle, respect isn't just shown in words, it's shown in movement, in posture, in the direction your body faces at any given moment. And one wrong turn literally can turn you from invisible into a problem. At this point, you're doing surprisingly well. You've mastered sitting, speaking, eating, looking, and even the deeply unnatural art of leaving a room without accidentally offending someone. So naturally, you assume personal hygiene is the one thing you don't have to worry about. After all, how dangerous can being clean possibly be? Very, because in a medieval castle, even how you smell sends a message. And like everything else here, it's the wrong message that gets you into trouble. Now, let's start with the obvious. If you're too dirty, that's a problem. Medieval life was not exactly known for modern hygiene standards, but that doesn't mean people were comfortable with someone who smelled like they had been living under a horse for a week. Too dirty and you're seen as careless, low status, or simply unpleasant. And unpleasant people tend to be avoided, which in a place where connections matter is not great. But here's where it gets complicated. If you're too clean, that's also a problem because excessive cleanliness can make people suspicious. Why do you smell better than everyone else? Who are you trying to impress? What are you hiding? Yes. Somehow being clean can make you look suspicious because strong scents, perfumes, oils, anything noticeable are often associated with wealth, influence, or intentions. And if you're not in a position to justify that level of refinement, people start asking questions quietly, which, as you've probably realized by now, is the worst kind of questioning. So, you're stuck in a very uncomfortable middle ground. Not too dirty, not too clean, just acceptable. Which sounds simple until you realize there is no clear definition of acceptable. It depends on who's around you. It depends on the setting. It depends on how much attention you're already attracting, which ideally is none. So, now you're thinking about things you never thought would matter. How you smell, how your clothes look, whether you appear too polished or not polished enough. And of course, you're trying to balance all of this without drawing attention to the fact that you're thinking about it. Because the moment it looks like you're trying too hard, you've already failed. So you settle for something safe, something neutral, something forgettable. Because in a castle, standing out, even for something as harmless as being clean, is still standing out. And standing out is never as safe as it sounds. By now you've noticed a pattern. Everything in this castle has a position. Where you sit when you speak, how you move, even how long you look at someone. It all comes back to one thing, your place. And the uncomfortable truth is your place is not very high. Now in your world, knowing your place sounds outdated. Optional, maybe even something you can challenge. In a medieval castle, it is not optional. It is the foundation of everything. Hierarchy is not just respected. It is enforced quietly when possible, publicly when necessary. And if you forget your place, someone will remind you, not gently, because reminders here are not meant to educate. They are meant to correct, and correction in this environment is often designed to be remembered. So what does forgetting your place actually look like? It's subtle. You stand a little too close to someone important. You speak slightly too confidently. You move through a space that isn't meant for you. Maybe a corridor, a doorway, a part of the hall, reserved for people with titles you definitely don't have. Individually, these seem like small things. Together, they create a pattern, and people notice patterns, especially when those patterns suggest that you don't understand the structure of the world you're in. Because in a castle, hierarchy is not just about power. It's about order, and order must be maintained. So when you step outside of your assigned role, even slightly, you're not just being awkward. You're disrupting something. And disruptions get corrected. Maybe it's a sharp word from a steward. Maybe it's a public adjustment. Being told where to stand, where to go, where you should have been all along. Or maybe it's something more subtle. A look, a tone, a shift in how people treat you. Less tolerance, less patience, more distance. Because once you've shown that you don't know your place, people stop trusting you to stay in it. And trust in a place like this is everything. So you adjust quickly. You observe more, move less, speak even less than before. You become careful in ways you didn't know were possible. Because now you understand something important. Your place is not something you choose. It's something you are given. And if you don't respect it, the castle will remind you exactly where you belong. By now, you've learned to stay quiet, not completely silent, just strategically invisible. You speak when spoken to. You move carefully. You avoid attention like it's contagious. So naturally, you assume you're safe. As long as you don't do anything obvious, and then someone important starts talking. Maybe it's the Lord. Maybe it's a noble. Maybe it's a noble. Maybe it's someone with just enough authority, then. And everyone else suddenly becomes very interested in whatever they're saying, even if what they're saying makes absolutely no sense. And here's the rule. When power speaks, you don't. You listen. You agree. You exist quietly in the background, while pretending that everything being said is both insightful and completely correct. Because interrupting someone powerful is not seen as engagement. It's seen as a challenge. And challenges in this environment are not handled through calm discussion. They are handled through correction. Now maybe you forget. Maybe there's a pause, a slight gap in conversation, and your brain, still operating under modern logic, decides this is your moment. You lean forward. You say something. Maybe it's helpful. Maybe it's logical. Maybe it's even correct. And immediately you feel it. Not a reaction. A shift. The person speaking stops slowly. Everyone else goes quiet. Not because they're interested in what you said, but because they're waiting to see what happens next. Because you didn't just speak, you interrupted. And not just anyone. Power. Which means you've just done something far more serious than making a social mistake. You've disrupted hierarchy. Now the person you interrupted has a decision to make. Ignore you and risk looking weak, or respond and restore their authority. And guess which option people with power usually choose? Best case scenario, you get a cold glance, a short, sharp reply that reminds you very clearly that your input was not required. Slightly worse, you're corrected publicly. Your place is reinforced in front of everyone just in case there was any confusion. Worst case, you've embarrassed someone important, and embarrassment, especially in a room full of witnesses, has a way of turning into something much more serious. So you learn. You don't jump in. You don't add to the conversation. You wait until you are invited, which may or may not ever happen. Because in a medieval castle, speaking is not about having something to say. It's about being someone who is allowed to say it. And right now, that someone is not you. At this point, you've stopped trying to understand the rules. You've accepted them. You sit carefully. You speak rarely. You move like you're being evaluated because you are. So naturally, you assume your face is safe. It isn't. Because in a medieval castle, even your reactions are being watched. Not just what you do, not just what you say, but how you respond to everything. A joke, a comment, a disagreement, a story. that is either incredibly boring or deeply uncomfortable. Your face becomes part of the performance, and unfortunately, your face has opinions. Now, in your world, reactions are normal. You laugh when something is funny. You frown when something is strange. You raise an eyebrow when something doesn't make sense. In a castle, those same reactions become signals. Laugh too loudly and you look disrespectful. Laugh too little and you look cold. Don't laugh at all when someone important makes a joke. And now you've created a problem, because humor in this setting is not about comedy. Humor in this setting is not about comedy. It's about alignment. If someone powerful laughs, you laugh. Maybe not too much, maybe not too little, just enough to show that you understood and approved. Even if the joke made absolutely no sense, especially then. Then there's surprise. Show too much of it, and you seem unstable. Show too little, and you seem uninterested. Either way, someone is quietly deciding what kind of person you are. And again, they are not generous in their interpretations. Anger not allowed. Fear not helpful. Confusion dangerous, because the moment your reaction doesn't match what's expected, people notice and they start asking silent questions. Why did you react like that? What are you thinking? Are you disagreeing? And disagreement, especially unspoken disagreement, has a way of becoming very visible very quickly. So now you're managing something you never expected to manage, your face. You soften your expressions. You control your reactions. You learn to respond in ways that are acceptable, neutral, safe. You become someone who reacts just enough to blend in, but never enough to stand out, which is exhausting, because now, not only are you thinking about where to sit, when to speak, and how to move, you're thinking about your eyebrows, your mouth, the exact timing of a nod, all of it carefully controlled. Because in this world, even a smile can be misinterpreted, and a single wrong expression can say more than 1,000 words, none of which you want to explain. By now, you've learned to stay quiet. You've learned to move carefully, react minimally, and exist in that very narrow space where you're present, but not noticeable. So, naturally, your brain does what brains do. It gets curious because none of this makes sense. Why is everyone so careful? Why are certain doors closed? Why does that one corridor seem important? Why does everyone suddenly go silent when a specific name is mentioned? And before you can stop yourself, you ask just a simple question, harmless in your mind, logical, maybe even polite. Something like, what's behind that door? Or, why is everyone avoiding that area? Or the classic, what did he mean by that? And instantly you feel it. That same shift you felt before. The subtle pause, the change in tone, the quiet realization that you've stepped somewhere you shouldn't. Because in a medieval castle, questions are not neutral. They are revealing. Every question you ask tells people something about you. What you notice, what you're interested in, what you don't understand, and more importantly, what you're not supposed to know. Because castles are not just homes. They are centers of power, politics, secrets, and alliances that are constantly shifting. Information is controlled carefully, and not everyone is meant to have access to it, especially not you. So, when you ask the wrong question, people don't just hear curiosity, they hear risk. Why are you asking that? Who told you anything? What are you trying to figure out? And suddenly, your harmless question becomes something much bigger. Suspicion. Best case scenario. You get a vague answer, something polite but empty, designed to give you nothing while making it seem like you've been answered. Slightly worse. The question is ignored entirely, which in this world is a clear signal to stop. Worst case. You've drawn attention to yourself in the worst possible way. Not as someone important, but as someone who doesn't know where the boundaries are. And people who don't understand boundaries tend to become problems. So, you adjust. You stop asking. You accept that there are things you're not meant to know. Doors you're not meant to open. Conversations you're not meant to unken. Conversations you're not meant to understand. Because in this place, knowledge is not shared freely. It's controlled. And the safest thing you can do is not look for answers at all. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can be is curious. By now, you've learned something important. The danger isn't always in what you do. Sometimes it's where you are. Because castles are not just big buildings, they are controlled spaces. Every hallway, every room, every staircase has a purpose, and more importantly, a level of access. Some places are public, some are restricted, some are restricted. Some are so clearly not meant for you that just standing nearby feels like a mistake, and somehow you end up in one of those places. Maybe you took a wrong turn. Maybe you were trying to avoid attention. Maybe you were just curious. Again, not your best habit, but now you're alone in a corridor that's too quiet, too empty. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels watched. And that's when you realize the real problem. You're not supposed to be here. Now being somewhere you shouldn't be is already bad. But being there alone, that's worst. Because now there are no witnesses, no context, no one to confirm that you simply got lost. So if someone finds you, and someone will, you don't look confused. You look suspicious. And suspicion in a medieval castle escalates quickly because people don't start with benefit of the doubt. They start with assumptions. What are you doing here? Who sent you? What were you looking for? And suddenly your harmless mistake becomes something much more serious. Espionage, intrusion, disrespect. All from standing in the wrong place, at the wrong time. And the worst part, you don't get to explain immediately because explanations come after judgment. First, you're observed, then evaluated, then addressed. And how that happens depends entirely on who finds you. A servant might quietly guide you away. A guard might question you. Someone important might not ask questions at all because, from their perspective, the situation is already clear. You're where you shouldn't be, and that's enough. So, you move carefully. You retrace your steps. You try to look like someone who absolutely knows where they're going, even though you very clearly don't, because confidence, even fake confidence, is safer than hesitation, and hesitation makes you look lost. And looking lost is what got you here in the first place. So you return to safer ground, back to the hall, back to the noise, back to the places where your presence is at least somewhat expected. Because now you understand something new. In a castle, survival isn't just about behavior. It's about location. And being in the wrong place, even for a moment, can too run you into a problem. By now, you've figured out how to survive the visible rules. You sit carefully, you speak rarely, you move like every step is being judged, which it is. So, naturally, you assume the real danger is over. It isn't because everything you've dealt with so far has been surface level, behavior, etiquette, position. Now you're entering something much more serious, expectation. Because in a medieval castle, loyalty is not something you choose. It's something you are expected to demonstrate constantly, and not quietly. You don't just be loyal, you look loyal. You sound loyal, you react like someone whose entire existence depends on supporting the person in charge, which, to be fair, it does. Now, in your world, loyalty can be complicated. You can agree with some things, disagree with others, keep your opinions private. In a castle, that kind of nuance doesn't exist. There is no partial loyalty. There is only clear alignment or doubt. And doubt is dangerous because the moment people sense hesitation, something slightly off in how you react, how you respond, how you carry yourself, they start asking questions. Not out loud, never out loud, but internally. Is he trustworthy? Is he reliable? Is he with us? And if the answer isn't an immediate yes, you've already become a problem. So now everything you do becomes a signal. When someone praises the Lord, you agree. When someone criticizes an enemy, you agree. When something clearly questionable happens, you still agree. Not enthusiastically, not excessively, just enough. Because too much loyalty looks fake, too little looks dangerous, and somewhere in the middle is survival. But here's the difficult part. You don't always know what you're supposed to be loyal to. People, families, alliances that shift without warning. Politics you don't fully understand, which means you're constantly adjusting, watching others, matching their tone, mirroring their reactions, trying to stay aligned with something that is always moving. And if you misread it, if you show support at the wrong moment or fail to show it when it matters, people notice. Because loyalty in this world is not assumed. It's observed, tested, and remembered. So you become careful, even more careful than before, because now it's not just about avoiding mistakes. It's about proving over and over again that you are not a risk, that you belong, that you can be trusted. And if you fail to do that, you won't be corrected. You'll be removed, because in a castle, loyalty is not optional. It's survival. By now, you've learned something deeply uncomfortable. Survival in a medieval castle is not about being impressive. It's about being forgettable, which goes against everything your brain naturally wants to do. Because normally being noticed is good. It means you matter. It means people see you, remember you, maybe even value you. Here, being noticed is risky because attention brings scrutiny. And scrutiny never ends well for someone in your position. No, this doesn't mean you disappear completely. That would also be suspicious. If you suddenly become too quiet, too still, too invisible, people start asking a different set of questions. Why is he hiding? What is he avoiding? What is he thinking? Which means you're stuck in another impossible balance. Visible, but not memorable. Present, but not important. You exist in the background, like part of the structure of the room itself. People see you, but they don't focus on you. You're there, but not in a way that demands attention. And achieving that is harder than anything you've done so far, because everything you do has the potential to stand out. Speak too clearly, memorable. Move too quickly, memorable. Even something as simple as standing in the wrong place for too long can make people notice you. And once you're noticed, you don't go back to being invisible. You become someone people watch. And being watched means everything you do is now under a microscope. Every word, every reaction, every small mistake you make becomes more significant, more visible, more likely to be remembered. And memory in a castle is dangerous because people remember patterns and patterns become judgments. And judgments become consequences. So you learn to reduce yourself. Not completely, just enough. You keep your movements measured, your voice controlled, your presence neutral. You avoid extremes. You avoid drawing attention in any direction. You become balanced, carefully, deliberately balanced, which again is exhausting because now you're not just managing what you do, you're managing how much of it people notice. And that requires constant awareness, constant adjustment, constant control. Because the safest place in a medieval castle is not at the top and not at the bottom. It's somewhere in the middle where you are seen but not remembered. Because once you're remembered, you've already stepped into something far more dangerous than invisibility. Long before the violin became the soul of classical music, before it filled concert halls or carried emotion across centuries, it simply didn't exist. At least not in the form we recognize today. But the need for it was already quietly building across medieval Europe. Music was everywhere, but it sounded different, rougher, less precise. Instruments like the rebec, the viol, and early fiddles were common, but they weren't designed for subtlety. They could entertain, accompany, and even impress, but they couldn't truly speak. And that was the problem. Because as music evolved, expectations began to rise. Courts no longer wanted just background noise during feasts. Churches no longer wanted, simple tones echoing through stone walls. Composers were starting to chase something more ambitious. Expression, depth, something that could mirror human emotion rather than just decorate it. The existing instruments weren't enough. The rebec, for example, had a sharp nasal tone. Effective, yes, beautiful, debatable. The viol was more versatile, but still lacked the refinement needed for the increasingly complex music being imagined. These instruments were practical, but they were not transformative, and that gap became impossible to ignore. Musicians wanted an instrument that could do more than just produce sound. They wanted something that could cry, whisper, tremble, and sing. Something that could move an audience without a single word being spoken. But creating something like that wasn't simple. It required precision, balance, an understanding of wood, tension, resonance, things that couldn't just be guessed. It required craftsmanship that bordered on obsession, and that kind of craftsmanship was beginning to emerge in one particular place, Cremona. At the time, Cremona was just another Italian city, not famous, not particularly dominant. But within its workshops Something unusual was happening. Craftsmen were experimenting, refining, quietly, pushing the boundaries of what string instruments could be. They weren't trying to invent the violin overnight. They were solving problems. How do you make the sound richer? How do you make the instrument more responsive? How do you give it a voice that feels alive? Each small improvement brought them closer to something new, something that hadn't yet been fully realized, but was starting to take shape. And without realizing it, these early craftsmen were standing on the edge of a transformation, because the violin wasn't born suddenly. It was built piece by piece, from centuries of trial, error, and quiet ambition. And soon, in the hands of the right makers, it would become something the world had never heard before. In Cremona, something unusual was happening inside small, quiet workshops. These weren't loud places filled with spectacle. They were controlled environments where every cut of wood, every curve, every measurement mattered more than it seemed, because this wasn't just instrument making. This was experimentation. Early luthiers, the craftsmen who built string instruments, began refining older designs, especially those inspired by the viol family. They adjusted shapes, changed proportions, tested different woods, maple for the back, spruce for the top. Not randomly, but because these materials responded in ways that felt promising. And here's where it gets interesting. They weren't chasing volume. They were chasing quality. A richer tone, a clearer response. A sound that didn't just exist, but projected. Something that could carry across a room and still feel intimate. Among the earliest names tied to this transformation was Andrea Amati, often considered one of the first true makers of the violin as we know it. His instruments were smaller, more refined, more balanced than their predecessors. The shape began to settle into something recognizable. Elegant curves, a narrow waist, a structure designed not just for sound, but for control. And that control changed everything, because suddenly the instrument wasn't just being played. It was being expressed through the bow. Another crucial development allowed for sustained notes, dynamic shifts, subtle variations in pressure. No longer limited to plucked or short tones, musicians could now draw sound out, shape it, stretch it, and for the first time the instrument began to resemble something alive. But perfection didn't come instantly. Each violin was slightly different. Each experiment carried risk. Some sounded incredible, hers less so. But the process continued, driven by a kind of quiet obsession that only true craftsmen understand. And slowly a standard began to emerge, a shape that worked, a balance that felt right, a sound that hinted at something greater. Cremona wasn't just building instruments anymore. It was defining them, and what started as a series of small improvements was now becoming something unmistakable. An instrument that didn't just accompany music, but had the potential to lead it. As the violin's shape began to settle in Cremona, something even more important emerged: mastery. Because designing a good instrument is one thing, perfecting it is something else entirely. And this is where the story shifts from experimentation to obsession. The early work of Andrea Amati had laid the foundation, but it was the generations that followed who would elevate the violin from a promising instrument into something almost mythical. Workshops in Cremona became places of quiet intensity where knowledge wasn't just taught, it was guarded, refined, and passed down like a secret language. Families of luthiers began to dominate the craft. The Amati family continued to refine proportions, smoothing out imperfections, chasing balance between strength and sensitivity. Their violins were elegant, controlled, almost polite in their tone, the kind of sound that fit perfectly within the courts of Europe. But then came a shift. A new generation of makers began pushing beyond refinement, toward power. Among them was Antonio Stradivari, a name that would eventually become synonymous with perfection. His violins weren't just well-made, they were different. Stronger projection, greater clarity, a tone that could cut through space without losing warmth, and perhaps most importantly, consistency. Stradivari seemed to understand something others were still chasing: how to control every variable. The arching of the wood, the thickness of the plates, the varnish, the exact placement of the FH holes. Nothing was accidental. Every detail served a purpose, even if that purpose couldn't always be explained. And then there was Giuseppe Guarneri, whose instruments took a slightly different path. Where Stradivari aimed for balance and brilliance, Guarneri's violins were darker, more aggressive, almost unpredictable. Not worse, just different. And for some players, that difference was everything. What's fascinating is this: no one fully understands why these instruments sound the way they do. Centuries later, experts still study them, measure them, try to replicate them. And while modern violins can come close, sometimes very close, there's still a lingering belief that something about those Cremonese instruments remains unmatched. Maybe it's the wood, maybe the varnish, maybe the craftsmanship, or maybe it's the fact that they were built during a moment when art, science, and obsession collided perfectly. Either way, by the time these masters were finished, the violin was no longer just an instrument. It was an ideal, and now it needed something else. Someone to prove what it could truly do. By the time the great makers of Cremona had refined the violin into something near perfection, one question still remained. What was it truly capable of? An instrument, no matter how beautifully crafted, is only as powerful as the hands that bring it to life. And for a time, the violin was still finding its place. Used in ensembles, supporting voices, adding color, but not yet fully standing at the center. That was about to change. As music entered the late 17th and early 18th centuries, composers began to realize something extraordinary. The violin wasn't limited to accompaniment. It could lead. It could carry entire pieces on its own, shifting from delicate whispers to intense, almost vocal cries in a way few instruments could match. And one of the first to truly understand this was Arcangelo Corelli. Corelli didn't just write for the violin. He wrote through it. His compositions explored its range, its expressive potential, its ability to hold attention without support. Under his influence, the violin began stepping forward, moving from the background into the spotlight. And once that door opened, others followed. Then came Antonio Vivaldi, a composer who seemed determined to test just how far the violin could go. Fast passages, dramatic contrasts, vivid imagery. His works, like the Four Seasons, didn't just use the violin. They transformed it into a storyteller. Suddenly, the instrument could imitate storms, birds, flowing water. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was narrative, and audiences noticed. The violin became exciting, unpredictable, capable of capturing attention in a way that felt new. Performers began pushing themselves as well, developing techniques that would have been unthinkable just decades earlier. Faster bowing, more complex fingerwork, greater control over dynamics. The instrument was evolving alongside the music. But with this rise came a new kind of figure, the virtuoso. Not just a musician, but a performer whose skills seemed almost impossible. Someone who didn't just play the violin, but dominated it, bending it to their will, showing audiences what the instrument could do at its absolute limits. And as these performers emerged, the violin's identity became clear. It wasn't just an instrument anymore. It was a voice capable of expressing joy, sorrow, tension, beauty, all within a single line of music. But as powerful as that voice had become, it was still only beginning, because soon someone would come along who wouldn't just master the violin. He would make it seem almost supernatural. By the early 19th century, the violin had already proven itself. Refined in Cremona, elevated by composers, and embraced by audiences across Europe. It could lead orchestras, carry emotion, and dominate the stage. But then came someone who changed the perception of what was even possible.
His name was Niccolo Paganini, and if the violin had found its voice before, Paganini turned it into something almost unreal.
From the moment he stepped onto a stage, there was something different about him. Tall, thin, almost ghost-like in appearance with long fingers that seemed designed specifically for the instrument. He didn't just play the violin. He attacked it, controlled it, pushed it beyond limits that other musicians didn't even attempt. And the sounds he produced, they didn't make sense. He played faster than anyone had seen, cleanly, effortlessly. He used techniques that seemed impossible. Rapid passages, harmonics that sounded like multiple instruments at once, playing on a single string as if the others were unnecessary. Audiences were stunned, and when people can't explain something, they tend to create explanations. Rumors began to spread that Paganini had made a deal with the devil, that no human could possess that level of skill without assistance. It sounds dramatic, but in an era where the supernatural still felt close to everyday life, many believed it. Paganini, of course, didn't exactly try to correct them. If anything, he leaned into the mystery. But behind the legend was something more grounded and far more impressive. Relentless dedication. Paganini had taken the violin and treated it not as a fixed instrument, but as something expandable. He explored every corner of its potential, inventing techniques, refining control, and pushing his own body to keep up with what he imagined. He didn't accept limitations. And because of that, the violin itself seemed to evolve again. After Paganini, the standard changed. What was once considered virtuosic became expected. Future violinists had to adapt to rise to a new level that he had essentially forced into existence. And more importantly, audiences began to see the violin differently. Not just as an instrument of beauty, but as an instrument of power, something capable of overwhelming skill, dramatic intensity, and almost theatrical performance. Paganini didn't just play the violin, he transformed it into a spectacle, and in doing so he ensured that the violin would never again be seen as quiet, delicate, or limited. It had become something far more dangerous and far more captivating. After Niccolò Paganini, the violin was no longer just respected. It was feared, admired, and expected to deliver something extraordinary. But just as the instrument reached new technical heights, the world around it began to change. Music was no longer confined to royal courts or private salons. The old system, where composers and musicians depended on aristocrats for support, was slowly fading. In its place, something new was emerging. Public concerts, large audiences, ticket sales, independent performers, and the violin was perfectly positioned to thrive in this new world. Its sound could carry across a hall. Its range allowed it to stand alone or blend seamlessly with an orchestra. And perhaps most importantly, it had already proven that it could captivate an audience on its own. Composers began writing with this in mind. Ludwig van Beethoven pushed the violin into deeper emotional territory, demanding not just technical skill, but intensity and expression. His violin concerto wasn't just a piece to be played. It was something to be endured, navigated, and ultimately conquered. Then came Johannes Brahms, who added weight and richness, treating the violin not as a light, decorative instrument, but as something capable of profound depth. His works required patience, control, and an understanding that went beyond technique. And alongside them, performers continued to evolve. Violinists were no longer just musicians. They were public figures, touring artists, specialists whose identities were tied to the instrument itself. The idea of the soloist became central, and the violin sat at the heart of that role. Concert halls replaced courts. Applause replaced patronage. But this shift came with its own pressure. Because now, instead of pleasing a small group of elites, violinists had to connect with entire audiences. People with different tastes, expectations, and attention spans. The performance wasn't just about precision anymore. It was about presence. Emotion had to be visible. Energy had to be sustained. And the violin, once a carefully crafted object in a quiet workshop, had now become something far larger. A bridge between composer and audience, between technique and feeling, between control and chaos. It had survived its birth, its refinement, and its transformation into a virtuoso instrument. Now it was stepping fully into its role as the voice of an entire musical era. And yet, even with all this evolution, one thing remained constant. The violin still demanded everything from the person holding it, and not everyone was ready to give that much. By the time the violin dominated concert halls across Europe, it had already earned its reputation as one of the most expressive instruments ever created. But behind that beauty, behind every effortless performance, there was something far less graceful: struggle. Because the violin, for all its elegance, is unforgiving. Unlike many instruments, it offers no shortcuts. There are no frets to guide the fingers, no fixed notes to rely on. Every pitch must be found precisely, adjusted constantly, controlled in real time. A fraction too high, and it sounds rained. A fraction too low, and it collapses. And that's just the beginning. The bow, the very thing that gives the violin its voice, requires its own level of mastery. Pressure, speed, angle, contact. Each movement changes the sound completely. Too much force, and the tone breaks. Too little, and it fades into nothing. Which means that learning the violin isn't just difficult, it's relentless. Young students often spend years producing sounds that can only be described as discouraging, not because they lack talent, but because the instrument demands something deeper than talent. It demands patience, discipline, and a tolerance for frustration that most people simply don't have. And yet, those who persist begin to understand something important. The difficulty is the point, because the violin doesn't just respond to technique, it reflects the person playing it. Tension, hesitation, confidence, control, all of it becomes audible. You can't hide behind the instrument. It exposes you. This is why mastery takes decades. Even the greatest violinists never truly finish learning. They refine, adjust, relearn. They refine, adjust, relearn. A passage that worked yesterday might feel different today. A tone that seemed perfect can always be improved. Perfection in this world is not a destination. It's a moving target. And that's what makes the violin so unique. It doesn't reward shortcuts. It doesn't tolerate complacency. It forces musicians into a constant dialogue with themselves. A process that is as psychological as it is technical. But for those who reach a high level, something shifts. The struggle begins to disappear. At least on the surface, movements become fluid. Sound becomes intentional. The effort that once felt overwhelming becomes invisible to the audience. And that's when the illusion is created. Because what looks effortless on stage is almost always built on years of frustration, repetition, and quiet persistence behind the scenes. The violin doesn't just demand skill, it demands commitment. And for those willing to give it everything, it offers something rare in return. A voice that feels entirely their own. By the 20th century, the violin had already lived several lives. It had been born in the workshops of Cremona, shaped by obsessive craftsmen, elevated by composers, and pushed to its limits by virtuosos like Niccolò Paganini. It had survived courts, revolutions, shifting audiences, and the rise of the modern concert hall. And yet, it didn't disappear. It adapted, because while many classical traditions began to fade or become confined to niche audiences, the violin did something unusual. It stepped outside its own world. It entered new genres. Folk traditions across Europe had always used violin-like instruments. But now the modern violin began blending into styles far beyond classical music. It appeared in Eastern European dances, Irish reels, Balkan melodies, each culture reshaping the instrument's voice to fit its own identity. The same instrument, completely different sound. Then came jazz. Suddenly, the violin wasn't just precise. It was improvisational, flexible, unpredictable. Players began bending notes, experimenting with rhythm, treating the viol less like a strict classical tool and more like a creative extension of themselves. And then eventually it reached modern genres, rock, film scores, even experimental electronic music. The violin proved something remarkable. It wasn't limited by tradition. It could evolve without losing its identity. At the same time, the instrument itself saw subtle changes. Materials improved. Construction became more consistent. Electric violins emerged, allowing amplification and effects that would have been unimaginable in earlier centuries. But here's the interesting part. Despite all this innovation, the C, or design barely changed. The shape developed in Cremona remained. The structure, the proportions, the balance, all of it was so effective that it didn't need reinvention. Modern makers refined it, yes, but they didn't replace it, which is rare. Most tools evolved dramatically over time. The violin didn't have to, and in the concert world it still held its position at the center. Orchestras continued to rely on it. Soloists continued to build careers around it. Composers continued to write for it, even as musical styles expanded in every direction. Because no matter how much music changed, one thing remained true. the violin could still do something few instruments could. It could feel human, not just in sound, but in expression, in nuance, in its ability to shift between strength and fragility within a single phrase. And that's why, even in a modern world, filled with new technology and endless options, the violin didn't become outdated. It remained relevant, because it wasn't just an instrument of the past. It was, and still is, an instrument of emotion. After centuries of evolution, from the early experiments in Cremona to the brilliance of virtuosos and the expansion into modern music, the violin stands in a position few instruments ever reach. It is no longer just part of music. It defines it. What makes the violin so powerful isn't just its history or the craftsmanship behind it, or even the legendary figures who mastered it. It's something far less tangible, something that can't be measured or fully explained. It feels human. More than almost any other instrument, the violin mirrors the human voice. It can cry without words, laugh without sound, tremble with uncertainty, or rise with confidence. A single note can carry tension. A phrase can feel like a conversation, and an entire performance can unfold like a story, even without a single lyric. That's not an oxyden. From the very beginning, the violin was shaped to respond to touch, to react instantly to pressure, speed, and intention. It doesn't produce sound on its own. It reflects the person holding it. Every movement, every hesitation, every moment of control or loss of control becomes part of what the audience hears, which means no two performances are ever truly the same, even when playing the exact same piece. That's why a violin in the hands of a beginner can sound harsh, unstable, almost resistant, while the same instrument in the hands of a master can feel effortless, alive, almost emotional, in a way that's difficult to describe. The difference isn't the instrument, it's the connection. And that connection is what has allowed the violin to survive everything. Changing tastes, new technologies, shifting audiences. While other instruments rise and fall in popularity, the violin remains constant because it offers something deeper than novelty. It offers expression, not just technical expression, but emotional honesty. It forces the musician to confront precision and feeling at the same time. It demands control, but rewards vulnerability. And perhaps that's the real reason it has endured. Because in a world where music constantly evolves, where styles come and go, the need to express something real, something human, never disappears. The violin doesn't just produce sound, it translates emotion. And that is why, from its quiet beginnings to the largest stages in the world, it has become more than an instrument. It has become a voice, one that centuries later is still being heard. Long before the great empires of Greece and Rome, before philosophers and conquerors shaped the Mediterranean world, there was an island civilization that seemed to exist in a different rhythm, quieter, more fluid, almost peaceful. On the island of Crete, surrounded by the deep blue of the Aegean Sea, the Minoan civilization began to take shape. And unlike many ancient cultures, it didn't start with war. It started with trade. Crete's position made it a natural crossroads between Egypt, the Near East, and mainland Greece. Ships came and went, carrying goods, ideas, and influences. Over time, small settlements grew into organized communities, and those communities into something far more complex. But here's what makes the Minoans unusual. They didn't build massive defensive walls, no towering fortresses, no clear signs of constant warfare, which is strange because most ancient civilizations were built around survival through strength, protection, conflict. But the Minoans seemed to rely on something else: control of the sea, economic power, and perhaps a level of stability that other cultures struggled to achieve. Instead of walls, they built something different. Palaces, not simple residences, but vast, intricate complexes, filled with corridors, storage rooms, workshops, and open courtyards. Places like Knossos weren't just homes for rulers. They were centers of administration, trade, and daily life. And they were complex, almost confusingly so. Always twisted, rooms connected in unexpected ways. Levels shifted. It wasn't designed like a simple structure. It felt more like a maze, which is where the story begins to blur into legend. Because centuries later, the Greeks would remember Crete not just as a place, but as the setting of a myth, a labyrinth, a creature hidden within it, a king and something monstrous beneath his palace. The story of the Minotaur may not be literal history, but it reflects something real. The impression these structures left behind. They weren't just buildings, they were overwhelming. And for a civilization that left no grand war records, no clear accounts of kings or conquests, that's what remains most striking. They built beauty, complexity, and art in a world that usually prioritized survival, which raises a question that historians are still trying to answer. Who were the Minoans really? And how did such a civilization rise only to disappear almost entirely from memory? At the heart of the Minoan civilization stood structures unlike anything else in the ancient world. Not fortresses, not temples in the traditional sense, but vast living systems of activity. The most famous of these was Knossos. And calling it a palace almost feels misleading because this wasn't just where a ruler lived. It was a center of administration, storage, religion, and daily life, all woven together into a single sprawling complex. Hundreds of rooms, multiple levels, staircases that seemed to lead everywhere and nowhere at once. It didn't feel organized. It felt alive. Corridors, twisted in unexpected directions. Rooms opened into courtyards, then narrowed again into tight passages. Light wells brought sunlight into the interior, creating shifting patterns of brightness and shadow throughout the day. And perhaps most surprising of all, there were no defensive walls surrounding it. In a time when most centers of power were heavily fortified, Knossos stood open, exposed, almost confident in its safety, which suggests something unusual. The Minoans may not have relied on walls because they didn't need to. Their strength likely came from the sea, a powerful maritime network that allowed them to control trade routes, project influence, and avoid constant invasion. In other words, their protection wasn't built in stone, it was built in movement. Inside the palace, the scale of organization becomes clear. Large storage rooms held massive clay jars known as pithoi, used to store oil, grain, wine, resources that supported not just the palace, but the wider population. Workshops buzzed with activity. Craftsmen shaped pottery, metal, textiles. This wasn't just a residence, it was an economic engine. And then there were the walls. Not bare, not defensive, but painted. Frescoes covered surfaces with scenes of nature, ceremonies and human activity. Bright colors, flowing movement, images of people interacting with the world rather than dominating it. No constant battle scenes, no glorification of war, just life. And that might be the most revealing detail of all. Because while other civilizations carved victories into stone, the Minoans painted motion, rhythm, and connection. Their art suggests a culture that valued experience over conquest. But there's a tension here because a society this open, this interconnected, this dependent on trade and stability is also vulnerable. And while Knossos may have stood without walls for a time, the question remains, what happens to a civilization built on balance when that balance is disrupted? If the palaces of the Minoan civilization reveal how the Minoans lived, their art reveals how they felt, and it's immediately different. In a world where many ancient cultures focused on power, conquest, and rigid order, the Minoans created something far more fluid. Their frescoes found in places like Knossos are filled with motion. Figures don't stand still. They twist, leap, dance. Even nature itself seems alive, almost in motion. There's energy everywhere. You see dolphins swimming across walls, flowing lines of waves, people engaged in rituals that feel more like performances than formal ceremonies. It doesn't look static. It doesn't, controlled. It looks alive. And then there's one of the most famous scenes, bull leaping. Young figures, both male and female, are shown vaulting over charging bulls, gripping horns, flipping through the air, landing behind the animal in a display that feels equal parts athletic and symbolic. It's not just a sport, it's something deeper, a ritual perhaps, a test of courage, a moment where humans and nature meet in a kind of controlled chaos, and what stands out is not fear. It's confidence. The Minoans didn't seem to depict themselves as struggling against the world. They appear integrated with it, moving through it, engaging with it, almost celebrating it. Even their depictions of people feel different. Women appear prominently in Minoan art, often dressed in elaborate clothing, participating in rituals, occupying visible roles. This has led many historians to believe that Minoan society may have had a different social structure compared to other ancient cultures, possibly giving women a more active or visible position. Not necessarily equal in a modern sense, but certainly not invisible. And then there's the absence. No large-scale war scenes, no kings towering over defeated enemies, no obvious glorification of violence. That doesn't mean conflict didn't exist, but it wasn't the center of their identity. Instead, their art suggests a culture focused on experience, movement, nature, ritual, and expression. But here's where things become uncertain. Because art can tell us what a civilization wanted to show, not necessarily everything it was. The Minoans left behind no clear written records we can fully understand. Their script, known as Linear A, remains largely undeciphered, which means their voice, their own explanation of who they were, is still out of reach. We see their world through images, through fragments, through interpretation. And while those images august a society full of color, rhythm, and balance, they also leave us with a question. What lies beneath a culture that appears so harmonious on the surface? And how much of that harmony was real? And how much was simply what they chose to leave behind? If Minoan art shows us movement, then Minoan religion shows us something deeper, something harder to define. Because unlike civilizations that left behind clear temples, named gods, and written myths, the Minoan civilization left us something far more uncertain. Fragments, images of rituals, symbols repeated across walls and objects, spaces that feel sacred, but without clear explanations. And at the center of it all, one image appears again and again. The bull. In places like Knossos, bulls are everywhere. In frescoes, carvings, and ceremonial objects, not just as animals, but as something symbolic, powerful, almost sacred. The bull leaping scenes we saw earlier likely weren't just performances. They may have been rituals, dangerous, controlled encounters that carried meaning beyond spectacle. And then there's the double axe known as the labrys. This symbol appears frequently in Minoan sites. Its exact meaning isn't fully understood, but it's often associated with religious spaces, suggesting it held ceremonial or spiritual importance. Together, these elements hint at a belief system centered on nature, strength, and transformation. Not rigid gods sitting above humanity, but forces that humans interacted with directly. And then there are the figures. Statues of women, often called snake goddesses, have been discovered, holding serpents, standing upright, dressed in elaborate clothing. Whether they were actual deities, priestesses, or symbolic representations is still debated. But one thing is clear: female figures held significance, which again sets the Minoans apart from many other ancient cultures, where male gods and rulers dominated religious imagery. Their sacred spaces also feel different. Instead of massive temples dominating city skylines, Minoan religious activity often took place in smaller, more intimate settings: caves, mountaintop shrines, hidden rooms within palaces, places that feel private, almost secret. And this brings us back to the idea of the labyrinth. The Greeks later told stories of a vast maze beneath the palace of Knossos, home to the Minotaur, a creature that was part man, part bull. It's almost certainly a myth, but like many myths, it may be rooted in something real. The complexity of the palaces, the importance of the bull, the sense of hidden spaces and rituals not fully understood. All of it feeds into the same impression. This was a civilization that didn't make everything visible. Their beliefs weren't written clearly. Their rituals weren't explained. Their symbols were left behind without instructions. And so what we're left with is not a complete picture, but a series of glimpses of a people who interacted with something they considered sacred, something tied to nature, to movement, to power, something that even now remains just out of reach. If the Minoan civilization built their world without walls, then the question becomes obvious. What protected them? The answer wasn't stone, it was the sea. From their island base on Crete, the Minoans developed something that few other early civilizations could match: control over maritime trade. Their ships moved across the Aegean with confidence, connecting distant regions and turning the sea into something less like a barrier and more like a highway. And through that highway, they built influence. Artifacts found across the Mediterranean suggest that Minoan goods, pottery, textiles, metals traveled far beyond Crete. They traded with places like ancient Egypt and the Near East, exchanging materials, techniques, and ideas. But trade wasn't just about goods. It was about connection. The Minoans became intermediaries, linking different cultures together. And in doing so, they didn't just grow wealth. They shaped the flow of information and influence across the region, which may explain something important. Their apparent lack of heavy fortifications. If you control the sea, you control access. If your ships dominate trade routes, you reduce the need for constant defense on land. Power in this case didn't come from armies standing at gates. It came from movement, reach, and presence. This idea has led historians to describe Minoan power as a form of thalassocracy, a sea-based dominance rather than a land-based empire. But power like this comes with its own risks because it depends on stability, stable routes, predictable conditions, reliable connections, and the sea, for all its advantages, is not always predictable. Storms can disrupt travel, routes can shift. External forces, other rising civilizations, can challenge control, and if that network weakens, the entire system begins to strain. There's also another question. Was their dominance truly peaceful? The lack of clear war imagery suggests a different approach to power. But that doesn't necessarily mean conflict didn't exist. It may have been less visible, less recorded, or simply expressed in ways we don't fully understand, because control, even of trade, often requires enforcement. Still, what remains remarkable is how the Minoans chose to present themselves, not as conquerors, not as destroyers, but as participants in a connected world. A civilization that thrived not by isolating itself, but by engaging with others, and for a time, it worked. The sea carried their influence far and wide, turning Crete into the center of something much larger than itself. But the same sea that brought them power would not be the thing that brought them down. For a time, the world of the Minoan civilization seemed stable, balanced between trade, culture, and a quiet kind of power that didn't rely on constant warfare. But no system like that remains untouched forever. And slowly, almost quietly, the first cracks began to appear. At first, they weren't obvious. Palaces continued to function. Trade routes still operated. Life, at least on the surface, seemed to continue as it always had. But beneath that surface, something was shifting, something that would eventually destabilize everything the Minoans had built. And then came the event that may have changed everything. The eruption of Thera, one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in human history. It tore through the island, now known as Santorini, sending ash high into the sky and triggering massive shock waves across the region. The explosion itself was devastating, but its effects went far beyond the immediate destruction. Ash fell across the Aegean. The sea reacted. Tsunamis may have struck the coasts of Crete, damaging ports and coastal settlements, the very infrastructure that supported Minoan trade and influence. Even if the core of the civilization survived the initial impact, the disruption would have been severe and, more importantly, unpredictable. Because the Minoans relied on stability, on consistent movement, reliable connections, and a network that functions smoothly. A disaster like this doesn't just destroy structures. It interrupts systems, trade slows, resources become uncertain, confidence weakens. And when a civilization is built on balance, disruption doesn't need to be total to be dangerous. But the eruption alone may not have been the end, because around the same period, another force was rising nearby, the Mycenaean civilization. Unlike the Minoans, the Mycenaeans were more openly militaristic. Fortified cities, clear evidence of warfare, a different approach to power. One built less on connection and more on control, and as Minoan stability weakened, that difference began to matter. Archaeological evidence suggests that eventually Minoan sites, including Knossos, came under Mycenaean influence or control. Whether through invasion, gradual takeover, or internal collapse, remains debated. But the result is clear. The Minoan system changed, and once that change began, There was no returning to what it had been. Because civilizations don't always fall in a single moment, sometimes they unravel slowly, quietly, until what once felt permanent becomes something fragile. And for the Minoans, that process had already begun. By the time the effects of the Thera eruption had settled, the Minoan civilization was no longer the same. But what makes their decline so unsettling is this. There is no clear final battle, no single dramatic collapse, no obvious moment where everything ends. Instead, what we see is something far more ambiguous. Destruction layers appear in archaeological sites, burned sections of palaces, damaged structures, signs that something went wrong. But these events don't all happen at once. They're spread out, inconsistent, almost fragmented. And that makes the story harder to define because it suggests that the fall of the Minoans wasn't a single event. It was a process. Some palaces were destroyed and rebuilt. Others were abandoned. Knossos itself continued to function for a time, but under different influences. The presence of the Mycenaean civilization becomes more visible. Their writing system, known as Linear B, appears where the undeciphered Minoan Linear A once dominated, which tells us something important. The culture didn't just disappear overnight. It was absorbed, transformed, gradually replaced. But even that explanation doesn't fully resolve the mystery, because we stared. I don't know exactly how this transition happened. Was it invasion? Was it internal collapse after environmental disaster? Was it a slow loss of control over trade and resources? Or was it all of these things at once? The lack of clear answers creates a strange kind of silence around their ending, and that silence contrasts starkly with what we know about them. A civilization full of color, movement, and life fading, without leaving behind a clear explanation. Even their writing adds to the mystery. Linear A remains undeciphered, which means we cannot read their records, their accounts, their own version of events. We see their world through architecture, art, and fragments, but we cannot hear their voice, and that absence matters because it turns their fall into something almost invisible. Not a dramatic ending, but a quiet disappearance. Over time, their influence merged into the cultures that followed. Elements of Minoan art, religion, and structure lived on, reshaped within Mycenaean society, and later Greek traditions. But the identity itself, the distinct, recognizable Minoan world, was gone. Not destroyed in a single moment, but worn down, replaced, and eventually forgotten. And perhaps that's what makes their story so compelling, because it reminds us that not all civilizations end with fire and conquest. Some simply fade until all that remains are ruins, symbols, and questions. For thousands of years, the Minoan civilization was gone. Not just gone in the sense of decline, but gone from memory. No written histories clearly described them. No continuous tradition preserved their identity. What remained were only fragments of myth, scattered references and ruins buried beneath time. To the ancient Greeks, Crete was a place of legend. They spoke of kings like Minos, of labyrinths beneath palaces, and of the Minotaur, a monster hidden at the center of a maze. These stories carried echoes of something real, but over time, myth replaced memory. The true civilization behind those stories remained hidden until the modern era. In the early 20th century, a British archaeologist named Arthur Evans began excavating a site on Crete that would change everything. Knossos. What he uncovered was not just a ruin. It was a revelation. Walls covered in frescoes, complex architectural layouts, storage rooms, staircases, courtyards, all preserved beneath layers of earth. The scale and sophistication of the site made one thing immediately clear. This was not a minor culture. This was a civilization. Evans named them the Minoans after the legendary king Minos, linking myth to archaeology in a way that still shapes how we understand them today. But his work also introduced controversy. In his attempts to reconstruct parts of Knossos, Evans made bold decisions, restoring walls, repainting frescoes, and interpreting structures based on his own theories. Some of these reconstructions helped bring the site to life. Others blurred the line between evidence and imagination, which means that even in rediscovery, the Minoans remain partially obscured. We see them through layers, ancient ruins, modern interpretation, fragments of myth. And then there's the writing. Clay tablets discovered at various sites reveal two scripts, Linear A and Linear B. While Linear B was eventually deciphered and linked to the Mycenaeans, Linear A remains a mystery. We still cannot read the Minoans' own words, which means that even after rediscovering their cities, their art and their structures, something essential is still missing. Their voice. And so the Minoans exist in a strange space, not fully lost, not fully understood. A civilization brought back into awareness, but still holding on to its secrets. Even after their rediscovery, the Minoan civilization refuses to fully reveal itself. We have their palaces like Knossos, their art, their symbols, their traces scattered across Crete and beyond. We have enough to recognize their presence, to admire their sophistication, to understand that they were not just another ancient culture, but one of the earliest complex civilizations in Europe. And yet something is missing, because for all we have uncovered, we still don't truly know them. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know how they described their world. We don't know how they understood their own rise or their fall. Their script, Linear A, remains undeciphered, a silent barrier between us and their thoughts. Every tablet discovered feels like a locked door, holding answers that we can see but not access. And that creates a strange kind of distance. Most civilizations leave behind a narrative, a voice that explains who they were, what they valued, what they feared. The Minoans left something different, an atmosphere, a sense of movement, color, and balance. A world where art flows, where structures feel alive, where power isn't always expressed through dominance. They feel less rigid than other ancient societies, less defined by conflict, more connected to rhythm and environment. That impression comes with uncertainty, because without their own words, we are interpreting them through fragments, through what survived, through what we choose to emphasize. And interpretation is not the same as certainty. Still, their influence lingers. Elements of Minoan culture appear in later Greek traditions, in myth, in symbolism, in stories that survived long after the civilization itself faded. The legend of the labyrinth, the image of the bull, the idea of a powerful island kingdom, all of it echoes something real, even if it has been reshaped over time, which means the Minoans were not truly erased. They were transformed, absorbed, bed into the cultural memory of those who came after them, even as their identity became less clear, and perhaps that is their most lasting legacy. Not a single defining moment, not a clear narrative, but a presence, a civilization that doesn't shout through history, but whispers through it in ruins, in myths, in unanswered questions. And maybe that's why they continue to fascinate us. Because in a world where so much has been explained, categorized, and understood, the Minoans remain just out of reach, close enough to see, but distant enough to remain a mystery. In the winter of 1756, in the quiet city of Salzburg, a child was born into a house that already sounded like a rehearsal hall. His name was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and unlike most children, he didn't grow into music. He seemed to arrive already, carrying it. His father, Leopold Mozart, was a respected violinist and teacher, but more importantly, a man who recognized something unusual almost immediately. This wasn't just talent. This was the kind of ability that makes other musicians quietly reconsider their life choices. By the age of 3, Wolfgang was already reaching for the clavichord, tapping out notes with tiny fingers that had no business being that precise. By 5, he wasn't just playing. He was composing actual pieces, structured, intentional, the kind of thing most adults struggle to fake convincingly. Leopold didn't waste time. He began training Wolfgang with the intensity of someone who knew he was holding something rare and fragile. Lessons were not optional. Discipline was not negotiable. Childhood, as most people understand it, was quietly removed from the schedule. But here's the strange part. Wolfgang didn't seem to mind. He absorbed music the way others absorbed language. Complex harmonies made sense to him before basic arithmetic probably did. He could hear a piece once and reproduce it. Not approximately, not close enough, exactly, which for anyone else in the room was both impressive and slightly unsettling. Soon the small apartment in Salzburg wasn't enough. Leopold began taking Wolfgang, along with his equally talented sister, across Europe. Royal courts, aristocratic salons, crowded halls. The child became a spectacle, not in a circus way, but close enough. People gathered to witness what felt like a glitch in reality. A boy who could outperform seasoned musicians without even looking particularly stressed about it. And while audiences applauded, something else was quietly forming beneath the surface. Expectation. Because when a child becomes a prodigy, the world stops asking what will he become and starts demanding what will he prove next. And Wolfgang, whether he realized it yet or not, had just stepped onto a stage he would never be allowed to leave. By the time Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart turned 6, his life no longer resembled anything close to normal. While other children in Salzburg were learning basic manners and trying not to spill soup, Wolfgang was being dressed up and presented before royalty, expected to perform flawlessly on command like a tiny powdered miracle. His father, Leopold Mozart, had a clear vision. Europe would not come to Salzburg, so Salzburg would go to Europe. And just like that, the Mozart family packed their lives into carriages and set off on what would become years of relentless travel. Court after court, city after city, Vienna, Paris, London. Each destination brought new audiences, new expectations, and the same silent question hanging in the air. Is he really that good? He was. Wolfgang would walking to grand halls filled with nobles who had heard every performance imaginable and then casually outperformed their expectations before dessert was even served. He played blindfolded. He improvised on the spot. He mimicked style. As of famous composers after hearing them once, as if you were politely showing them how their own music could be improved. Naturally, this made people both amazed and slightly uncomfortable. In Vienna, he reportedly climbed onto the lap of Maria Theresa as a child, treating imperial protocol like a mild suggestion. It was charming, mostly because he was too young to understand how inappropriate that actually was. If an adult had tried it, they would have been escorted out quickly. But beneath the applause, the reality was less glamorous. The roads were long. The weather was brutal. Illness followed them like an uninvited guest. Money, despite the prestige, was inconsistent. For all the admiration Wolfgang received, it didn't always translate into security. Applause, it turns out, does not pay bills. A lesson he would keep relearning for the rest of his life. And then there was the pressure, because each performance wasn't just a concert, it was proof. Proof that he was still extraordinary. Proof that the miracle hadn't faded. Proof that the child prodigy hadn't suddenly become just a child. And so he played, not because he had to be forced, but because it was the only thing that truly made sense to him. But as the tours stretched on and the novelty slowly began to wear thin, a quiet, uncomfortable truth started to emerge. The world loved a prodigy, but it had no idea what to do with a genius who was growing up. As Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart grew older, something subtle but dangerous began to change. He was no longer just the charming child who impressed courts with effortless brilliance. He was becoming an adult, and with that came a problem no one had prepared for. A prodigy can be controlled. A genius, not so much. Back in Salzburg, Wolfgang found himself employed under Hieronymus Colloredo, a man who valued music, but mostly as background decoration for his own importa. Ends. For Colloredo, Mozart wasn't a revolutionary artist. He was staff, replaceable, expected to follow orders, compose on demand, and ideally not develop opinions. This did not go well. Wolfgang had spent his childhood performing for kings, dazzling Europe, and being treated like something extraordinary. Now he was expected to sit quietly, write what he was told, and behave like a well-trained employee. It was, to put it mildly, not his preferred lifestyle. Tension grew quickly. Colloredo wanted obedience. Mozart wanted freedom. Colloredo wanted control. Mozart wanted expression. Colloredo saw a servant. Mozart saw himself as something far greater. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Mozart was right. But being right doesn't mean you win. Wolfgang began pushing boundaries, refusing to be treated as just another court musician. He traveled without permission, he argued. He resisted, and in a world where hierarchy was everything, This kind of behavior wasn't seen as bold, it was seen as disrespectful. The breaking point came in Vienna. After one too many conflicts, Mozart was dismissed from the archbishop's service. Not politely, not ceremoniously. According to accounts, he was literally kicked out. Dismissed with an insult that made it very clear where he stood in the social order. For most people, this would have been a disaster. For Mozart, it was something else entirely. Freedom. For the first time in his life, he was no longer under his father's constant direction, or a noble's authority. No schedule, no leash. No one telling him what he could or couldn't create. Which sounds great until you realize what he had just lost. Stability, income, protection. Because in 18th century Europe, being a freelance artist wasn't a bold career move. It was closer to financial roulette. And Mozart had just placed his entire life on the table. Still, he didn't hesitate. He chose Vienna. He chose independence. He chose risk. And as history would prove, he also chose a path that would lead him to create some of the most extraordinary music ever written, while slowly walking toward a life that would never be as secure as it once seemed. When Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart arrived in Vienna as a free man, it must have felt like stepping onto the grandest stage in Europe. This was the cultural heart of the continent, a city filled with aristocrats, musicians, and endless opportunity. If you were going to prove your genius anywhere, this was the place. And at first, it worked. Mozart quickly made a name for himself. His piano performances were electric, not in a loud, chaotic way, but in that unsettling, precise way, where every note feels inevitable. Audiences were stunned. He improvised effortlessly, outplayed rivals, and composed with a speed that made other composers look like they were politely taking their time. Money began to flow in, not consistently, but enough to create the illusion of stability. He rented a comfortable apartment. He dressed well. He moved through Vienna like a man who had finally arrived. And in 1782, he married Constanze Weber, a decision that his father, unsurprisingly, did not approve of. But Wolfgang was done asking for permission. For a brief moment it looked like everything had aligned, and then reality caught up. Because Vienna was not just full of opportunity, it was full of competition. Talented composers were everywhere, all trying to secure the same patrons, the same commissions, the same attention. And Mozart, despite his brilliance, had one critical flaw. He didn't play the game. He wasn't particularly good at networking in the way society expected. He didn't flatter the right people consistently. He didn't always follow trends. And perhaps worst of all, he didn't simplify his music to make it easier for casual audiences. His work was brilliant, but sometimes too complex, too demanding, too ahead. And audiences, as it turns out, don't always reward genius immediately. Sometimes they just move on to something easier to digest. Financial problems began creeping in quietly at first, then more aggressively. The comfortable lifestyle became harder to maintain. Debts appeared. Letters asking for money became more frequent. And the same man who had once performed for kings was now struggling to keep up appearances in a city that was slowly losing interest, but creatively he was unstoppable. This period saw the creation of masterpieces, works that would outlive every critic, every rival, every fleeting trend in Vienna. Operas, symphonies, concertos, each one pushing boundaries, each one refusing to settle for mediocrity. So here's the contradiction. Mozart was producing some of the greatest music ever written, while his own life was becoming increasingly unstable. And the gap between those two realities was only getting wider. By the mid-1780s, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart had secured something rare in Vienna: recognition. Not universal admiration, not overwhelming wealth, but enough attention to be noticed. And more importantly, enough to attract rivals. Because success, even partial success, tends to do that. Among the names often tied to Mozart's story is Antonio Salieri, a respected and well-established composer at the imperial court. Unlike Mozart, Salieri understood the system. He navigated court politics carefully, built relationships, and maintained a stable position within Vienna's musical hierarchy. Naturally, this created a contrast that history would later exaggerate into something far more dramatic. Were they rivals? Yes. Was it a personal war filled with sabotage and jealousy? Probably not in the way later stories suggest. But here's the truth that matters. Mozart felt the competitor. Vienna was a city where reputation could shift quickly. One successful opera could elevate you. The next could quietly disappear. And Mozart, for all his brilliance, didn't always win the crowd immediately. His music demanded attention, patience, and a level of understanding that not every audience was willing to give. Take The Marriage of Figaro, for example. Today, it's considered a masterpiece. At the time, it stirred both admiration and controversy. Its themes, social tension, class dynamics, subtle rebellion, made it more than just entertainment. It made it uncomfortable, and uncomfortable art doesn't always get immediate applause. Then came Don Giovanni, darker, more intense, blending humor with something almost unsettling. Again brilliant, again not universally embraced at first. Mozart was walking a strange line. He was too innovative to be easily accepted, yet too visible to be ignored. And in that space, rumors began to grow. Whispers of jealousy, stories of enemies, the idea that others were working against him. Some of it may have been real, much of it was likely exaggerated. But for Mozart, perception mattered just as much as reality, and the more pressure he felt financially, socially, creatively, the more those shadows seemed to close in. Meanwhile, his lifestyle didn't help. He spent money freely when he had it, lived as if success would always return, and struggled to adjust when it didn't. Debt became a recurring theme. Letters asking for loans became more urgent, and the image of the confident rising composer began to crack. Yet through all of this, one thing remained constant. The music kept getting better, sharper, deeper, more daring, almost as if the tension around him wasn't slowing him down, but pushing him towards something even greater and perhaps something darker as well. By the late 1780s, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was living in a strange contradiction, a man creating music that would echo for centuries, while his own life seemed to be quietly slipping out of control. In Vienna, the excitement that once surrounded him had begun to fade. Audiences hadn't turned against him completely, but the novelty was gone. New composers emerged, tastes shifted, and Mozart, as always, refused to simplify himself just to keep up, which is admirable and financially disastrous. Concert opportunities became less frequent. Commissions slowed. The steady flow of income he once relied on turned into something unpredictable, and unpredictability, as Mozart would repeatedly discover, does not mix well with rent. His letters from this period tell the story clearly. He wasn't just struggling, he was asking for help. Money, loans, extensions. The tone shifts from confident to urgent, from hopeful to quietly desperate. It's not the image most people associate with a genius, but it's a very real part of the story. And yet, creatively, he was reaching new heights. Works like The Magic Flute began to take shape, a piece filled with symbolism, mystery, and a strange blend of light and darkness. It wasn't just music anymore. It felt like a reflection of something deeper, something personal. At the same time, Mozart became involved with Freemasonry, a society that valued enlightenment, reason, and hidden meaning. These ideas began to weave themselves into his compositions, adding layers that went far beyond simple entertainment. But while his mind expanded, his body began to show signs of strain, fatigue, illness, exhaustion, fatigue, illness, exhaustion. Whether it was the stress, the workload, or something more serious, it was clear that Mozart was no longer operating at the effortless pace of his youth. The energy was still there, but it came at a cost. And then there was the pressure. Not just to survive, but to prove again that he still mattered, because being a former prodigy is a dangerous position. People don't remember what you were. They judge what you are now, and Mozart, despite everything he had achieved, was constantly being measured against expectations that were nearly impossible to sustain. Still, he pushed forward, composing, performing, when he could, trying to maintain the life he had built, even as it became harder to hold together. And as the world around him grew quieter, more uncertain, one thing became increasingly clear. Mozart was approaching something. Not just another composition, not just another success, but something that felt final. By 1791, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was already stretched thin, financially strained, physically exhausted, and yet still composing with a kind of urgency that felt different from before, faster, deeper, almost as if time itself had started pressing against him. And then a stranger appeared. According to accounts, a mysterious messenger arrived at Mozart's store in Vienna, dressed in grey, carrying a commission unlike any other. He asked Mozart to compose a requiem, a mass for the dead. No explanation, no identity, just a request and payment. It sounds like the beginning of a legend, and in many ways, it became one. Mozart accepted because he needed the money, because he needed the work, and perhaps because something about the request spoke to him on a level he couldn't quite explain. As he began composing what would become Requiem in D minor, something strange began to happen. He became obsessed. This wasn't just another piece. It consumed him. He worked on it between other obligations late into the night, often while already weakened by illness. And the more he wrote, the more convinced he seemed to become that this wasn't just a commission. It was his own requiem, a piece he was writing for himself. Now, to be clear, history offers a more grounded explanation. The calm mission likely came from Franz von Walsegg, a count known for anonymously commissioning works and passing them off as his own. The mysterious stranger was probably just a messenger following orders. But Mozart didn't know that, and perception, especially under stress, has a way of reshaping reality. His health continued to decline. Fever, weakness, swelling. Yet, he kept composing dictating sections of the Requiem. Even when he was too ill to write, it was as if he were racing against something he couldn't see, trying to finish before it caught up. Around him, concern grew. His wife, Constanze Mozart, tried to manage both his condition and their finances. Friends visited, students assisted, but the atmosphere had changed. There was urgency in the room and something else, too. A sense that Mozart himself believed the end was near. Whether that belief came from illness, exhaustion, or the psychological weight of the commission, we can't say for certain. But what we do know is this: the music he was writing during this time carried a depth, a gravity that felt different from everything before it. Not just brilliant, but final. And as the Requiem slowly took shape, one question lingered, quiet, unsettling, impossible to ignore. Would he live long enough to finish it? In the final weeks of 1791, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was no longer just a struggling composer. He was a man visibly fading. In Vienna, winter settled in cold and heavy, and inside his home, the atmosphere had grown tense. Mozart was bedridden, his body weakened by illness that no one could clearly diagnose. Swelling, fever, exhaustion, symptoms that came and went, but never truly left. And yet the music continued even as his strength failed him. Mozart worked on the Requiem in D minor. He dictated sections to his student Franz Xaver Süssmayr, his voice growing weaker, but his mind still sharp, still precise. He would hum passages, correct mistakes, refine details as if the piece had to be completed, no matter the cost. At times, he reportedly broke down, convinced he was writing the music for his own funeral. Whether this was fear, intuition, or simply the result of exhaustion, it added a haunting layer to everything happening around him. The line between composer and composition seemed to blur. The Requiem wasn't just something he was creating. It was something he was living through. Friends gathered. They tried to comfort him, to keep the mood light, to believe this would pass like previous illnesses. But this time felt different. There was no recovery. On December 5th, 1791, Mozart died at just 35 years old. No grand ceremony, no royal farewell, no dramatic final performance, just silence. He was buried in a common grave, as was typical for the time in Vienna, a detail that would later fuel myths of poverty and neglect. But the truth is less theatrical and perhaps more unsettling. One of the greatest musical minds in history left the world quietly, without the recognition his legacy would later demand. The Requiem remained unfinished. After his death, Franz Xaver Süssmayr completed the work, guided by Mozart's notes and instructions. It would go on to become one of the most powerful and mysterious compositions ever written, forever tied to the image of a dying composer racing against time. And just like that, the child prodigy who had once amazed kings and emperors was gone, no longer performing, no longer composing, leaving behind a body of work that seemed impossibly vast for such a short life. But perhaps the most haunting part of Mozart's story isn't how he died. It's how much more it feels like he still had left to say. When Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart died in 1791, the world did not stop. There was no immediate recognition that something irreplaceable had just been lost. No sense that music itself had shifted. In Vienna, life continued as it always had. Concerts, court events, new composers rising to take the stage. Mozart's passing was noted, but not fully understood. That realization would come later, much later, because Mozart's true legacy didn't explode overnight. It unfolded slowly, almost quietly, as musicians and audiences began to revisit his work. And when they did, something became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just good music. This was something else entirely. Composers like Ludwig van Beethoven studied his pieces, learning from their precision, their balance, their emotional clarity. Mozart had an ability that few others possessed. He could make complexity feel effortless, beauty feel inevitable, and emotion feel honest. His operas, The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, The Magic Flute, began to gain the recognition they hadn't fully received during his lifetime. Audiences started to understand them, not just as entertainment, but as layered works filled with psychology, humor, darkness, and insight into human nature. And then there was the Requiem in D minor. Even unfinished, it carried a weight that felt almost otherworldly. The idea that Mozart may have believed he was writing his own funeral music only deepened its mystique. Over time, it became more than a composition. It became a symbol of genius, of mortality, of a life that burned intensely, but briefly. The myths grew as well. Stories of rivalry with Antonio Salieri were exaggerated into dramatic tales of jealousy and murder. The image of Mozart as a misunderstood genius, unappreciated in his time, took hold. Some of it was true, much of it was shaped by storytelling. But the core of it remained undeniable. Mozart had changed music. He bridged eras, refined form, and pushed emotional expression further than many thought possible. And he did it all in just 35 years. A timeline that feels almost unreal when compared to the scale of his output. Today, his name is no longer just known. It's permanent. Played in concert halls, studied in classrooms, recognized across cultures and generations. And perhaps that is the final quiet irony of his life. The world that struggled to fully understand him while he was alive eventually built an entire legacy around him after he was gone. The unseen order, what castles, violins, and lost civilizations teach us. We have traveled together through 3 very different worlds. The rigid, silent corridors of a medieval castle where every glance and gesture carried meaning. The quiet workshops of Cremona where wood and varnish were shaped into voices that would sing for centuries. And the sun-washed palaces of Crete, where a civilization painted dolphins on walls and built labyrinths without walls. At first glance, these stories seem unrelated. One is about survival in a place where hierarchy was everything. Another is about the slow, obsessive birth of an instrument that would capture the human soul. The third is about an island people who traded instead of conquered, who painted motion instead of war, and who faded into myth without leaving a clear explanation. But if you listen closely, if you let the echoes of these stories settle, a pattern begins to emerge. They are all, in their own way, about the same thing. The invisible structures that hold human life together. The rules you cannot see. The craftsmanship that takes generations to perfect. The civilizations that whisper through ruins and legends. And they all ask a question that lingers quietly beneath the surface of history. What makes something last? Let us begin with the castle, because the castle is the most obvious. It is a place of walls, of gates, of stone that has stood for centuries. But we learned that the real castle was not made of stone. It was made of rules. Unwritten, unspoken, but absolutely enforced. Where you sat told people who you were. When you spoke, told people what you were worth. How you looked, how you moved, how you left. A room, all of it, was a language. And if you did not speak that language, you did not survive. Not physically, perhaps, but socially. And in a castle, social death was often the first step towards something worse. The lords and ladies who thrived in that world understood something that modern life often obscures, that every society, no matter how advanced, runs on invisible agreements. We like to think we are free, that we can sit where we want, say what we think, ask whatever question comes to mind. But the castle reminds us that freedom is always relative. There are always rules. The only difference is whether you know them. The medieval guest who sat in the wrong chair did not mean to cause offense. He simply did not know. And in that gap between intention and perception, danger lived. The same is true today. We have our own hierarchies, our own silent languages, the way we dress for a job interview, the way we phrase an email to a superior, the way we laugh at a joke we do not find funny. These are not medieval relics. They are the same instinct, dressed in different clothes. The castle teaches us that survival is not always about strength. Sometimes it is about attention, about watching, learning, and knowing when to remain invisible. But the castle also teaches us something else. It teaches us that power is fragile. The lord at the high table seemed untouchable. But we know from history that lords fell. Castles were besieged. Dynasties crumbled. The same hierarchy that protected the powerful also made them targets. And when the walls fell, the rules fell with them. The guest who once worried about where to sit suddenly found himself in a world where chairs no longer mattered. That is the strange paradox of order. It gives stability, but it also creates vulnerability. The more rigid the system, the more spectacular its collapse. We saw this in the Bronze Age when 40 cities fell in 50 years. We see it in the Minoans, whose palaces without walls could not survive the storms that came from the sea. We see it in Mozart, who could not bend to the expectations of Vienna and paid the price. The violin, too, has its own version of this fragility. A Stradivarius is worth millions, but it is still a piece of wood. Drop it, and it shatters. The sound that moves audiences to tears is held together by nothing more than tension, friction, and the careful placement of a bridge. It is a miracle of engineering, but it is also a reminder that the most beautiful things are often the most delicate. The Minoans built their civilization on trade, on connection, on the assumption that the sea would always carry goods and ideas. But the sea does not always cooperate. Volcanoes erupt, tsunamis strike, trade routes shift, and when the network frayed, the palaces emptied, not with a bang, but with a slow, quiet departure. People simply left. They took what they could carry and walked away. The walls did not fall because they were not there. The civilization did not collapse in a single battle because there was no battle. It faded like a fresco exposed to too much sun. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling kind of disappearance. Not the dramatic end, but the one you do not notice until it is already too late. What makes something last? The violin gives us one answer. The violin gives us one answer. It lasts because it was made with obsession. The luthiers of Cremona did not build instruments for a single generation. They built them for centuries. They experimented with wood, with varnish, with the exact curve of the F-hole. Not because they wanted to sell more violins, but because they wanted to make a sound that had never been heard before. That kind of craftsmanship takes time. It takes failure. It takes a willingness to discard what does not work and refine what does. Andrea Amati laid the foundation. Stradivari built the cathedral. Guarneri added the shadow. And each of them learned from the one who came before. The violin is not the product of a single genius. It is the product of a tradition, of knowledge passed from hand to hand, of small improvements accumulated over decades. That is how things last, not through brilliance alone, but through continuity. The Minoans also had continuity, but of a different kind. They did not build walls, but they built connections. Their influence spread not through conquest, but through trade. Minoan pottery has been found in Egypt, in Syria, in the islands of the Aegean. Their art inspired the Mycenaeans, who would later inspire the Greeks. Even after their palaces emptied, their images lingered. The bull, the double axe, the figure of the goddess, with snakes. All of these survived in myth, in ritual, in the stories that people told around fires long after Knossos had fallen silent. The Minoans did not last in stone, they lasted in memory. And memory, as the violin reminds us, is a kind of craftsmanship too. It requires attention. It requires repetition. It requires repetition. It requires someone to care enough to pass the story on. Mozart too lasted in memory. But his memory was shaped by absence. He died young, poor, and only partially recognized. The Requiem was unfinished. The commissions had dried up. The audiences had moved on. And yet, within a generation, his music was being played across Europe. Within 2 generations, he was a legend. Within 3, he was a symbol of genius itself. What changed? Not the music. The music had always been there. What changed was the willingness to listen. It took time for audiences to catch up to what Mozart had written. The Marriage of Figaro was considered controversial, even dangerous. Don Giovanni was too dark, too strange. The Magic Flute was too whimsical, too symbolic. But eventually, people began to understand. They heard what Mozart had heard. They felt what he had felt. And once that happened, his music became permanent. Not because it was popular, but because it was true. And truth, unlike fashion, does not fade. The castle teaches us about rules. The violin teaches us about craftsmanship. The Minoans teaches us about mystery. But all 3 teaches about the same thing, the human need to create order in a world that is constantly threatening to fall apart. The lord at the high table needed the rules of seating to feel secure. The luthier in Cremona needed the perfect curve of the F-hole to feel that his work was complete. The Minoan priestess needed the bull-leaping ritual to feel that she could touch something sacred. These are not trivial desires. They are the foundations of civilization. Without them, we are just animals huddled in the dark. But the problem is that order, once created, tends to harden. The rules that helped the castle function also made it brittle. The traditions that guided the luthier also limited him. The rituals that gave meaning to the Minoans also blinded them to the storms gathering on the horizon. This is the tension that runs through all of history. We need order to survive, but too much order, or the wrong kind of order, can be just as dangerous as chaos. The castle guest who sat in the wrong chair was not a threat to the hierarchy. He was just ignorant, but the hierarchy treated him as a threat because it could not afford to make exceptions. That is the nature of rigid systems. They punish the innocent along with the guilty. And in doing so, they create resentment, which is the seed of rebellion. The Minoans did not have walls, but they had something else. Confidence in their network. They believed that the sea would always protect them, the trade would always flow, that the palaces would always stand, that confidence was not unreasonable. It had been true for centuries, but it was also fragile, because the sea does not care about human confidence. The Thera eruption did not ask permission. The tsunamis did not ask permission. The tsunamis did not check the trade routes. And when the network broke, the Minoans had no walls to fall back on. Their strength was also their weakness. Mozart, too, had a kind of confidence. He believed that his music would speak for itself. He did not flatter the right people. He did not follow the trends. He composed what he heard, and he assumed that the world would eventually hear it, too. That confidence was justified, but it also left him vulnerable. He died in debt, exhausted, and largely forgotten by the city that had once celebrated him. The world did catch up, but not in time to save him. That is the tragedy of genius. It is often ahead of its time, and time is not always kind. So what do we take from these stories? Not a simple lesson, because history does not offer simple lessons. It offers patterns, echoes, and quiet warnings. The castle warns us that hierarchies, while necessary, can become prisons. The violin warns us that mastery takes time, and that the best work is often done in obscurity. The Minoans warn us that even the most stable systems can collapse when the shocks come from unexpected directions, but they also offer hope. The castle fell, but the rules of hierarchy did not disappear. They evolved. They became the manners of the Renaissance, the protocols of the court, the etiquette of the modern office. The violin was almost lost, but the knowledge of Cremona was preserved in a few instruments, in a few notebooks, in the hands of a few apprentices who carried the tradition forward. The Minoans faded, but their art lived on in Mycenaean frescoes, in Greek myths, in the way later civilizations imagined the past. Nothing is ever truly lost. It is only transformed. That is the quiet comfort of history. The things we build, the rules we make, the songs we write, they do not disappear. They become part of the landscape, part of the memory, part of the foundation for whatever comes next. The medieval guest who sat in the row chair is long dead, but the lesson he learned about watching, about listening, about lowering your place is still with us. The luthier who spent decades perfecting a single curve is gone, but the violin he made still sings. The Minoan priestess who danced with bulls is a ghost, but the image of that dance frozen in fresco still moves us. We are not separate from these stories. We are part of them. Every time we choose a seat at a table, we are reenacting a medieval ritual. Every time we listen to a piece of music, we are hearing the echo of Cremona. Every time we look at a ruin and wonder what it was, we are touching the Minoan mystery. The past is not behind us. It is inside us. And if we are lucky, if we pay attention, we can learn from it without having to repeat its mistakes. As you drift towards sleep, let these images settle. See the great hall of the castle, the fire flickering, the lord at the high table, the guest who sits in the wrong chair. Watch how the room shifts, how silence becomes a language, how power is performed rather than declared. Then let the hall fade. See the workshop in Cremona, the shavings of maple on the floor, the luthier holding a piece of wood to the light, turning it slowly, searching for the grain that will carry the sound. See the finished violin, the varnish still wet, the strings not yet taut. Hear the first note. Hear the first note. Then let the workshop dissolve. See the palace of Knossos, the fresco of the bull leaper, the young figure suspended in air, the horns of the bull just below. See the light coming through the light wells, shifting across the painted walls. See the storage jars full of oil, the merchants at the harbor, the ships leaving for Egypt. And then see the ash falling from Thera, the tsunamis receding, the empty corridors, the silence. See the Mycenaean scribe writing in Linear B, not knowing that he is recording the end of a world. See the Greek poet, centuries later, singing about a labyrinth and a monster, not knowing that he is preserving a memory. See the archaeologist, brush in hand, uncovering a fresco that has not seen the sun in 3,000 years. See yourself, in this quiet room, reading these words, connected to all of it by the thin thread of attention. That thread is not nothing. It is the only thing that matters, because attention is what turns the past into the present. It is what makes the violin sing, the fresco speak, the castle live again. Without it, history is just noise. With it, history is a conversation that never ends. So rest, now. Let the images fade. You have traveled through centuries, through stone and wood and painted plaster, through the silent rules of power and the obsessive craft of genius, and the quiet mystery of a civilization that chose to build without walls. You have seen how fragile order can be and how resilient. You have seen how beauty is made and how it lasts. And you have seen how much of history is not about kings and battles, but about the small, unnoticed choices that shape the world. Where to sit, when to speak, how to hold a bow, how to mix a pigment, how to remember a story. These are not small things. They are the things that make us human. And they are still with you, even now, as the night deepens and your breathing slows. You do not need to remember every detail. You only need to carry the feeling that the world is older and stranger and more connected than it seems. The feeling that the past is not a foreign country, but a familiar room, lit by the same fire that warms you now. The feeling that you too are part of the story, that your choices matter, that the attention you give to the world is a kind of craftsmanship. That is the quiet lesson of the castle, the violin, and the labyrinth. It is not about power or nias or mystery. It is about presence, about being here, now, in this moment, and knowing that this moment is connected to all the others. So let the last image go. Let the last sound fade. Let the last question dissolve into the darkness. There is nothing more to solve tonight. The mysteries will wait. They have waited for centuries. They will wait for you to return. For now, rest. Rest deeply. Rest peacefully. Rest like the Minoan priestess in her painted palace, like the luthier in his quiet workshop, like the guest who finally learned to sit still. The night is yours. The story is done. And in the morning, when you wake, you will carry a little of it with you without even knowing. That is how history works. That is how memory works. That is how the violin still sings, centuries after the hands that made it turn to dust. The silent cathedral. What we learn when we stop talking. We have spent many hours together, walking through great halls and quiet workshops, through palaces without walls and concert halls, filled with echoes. We have watched guests struggle to find their place at medieval tables, listened to violins that seemed to cry with human voices, and stood in the ruins of Knossos, wondering what the frescoes meant. But now, as this long journey draws toward its final stillness, let us step into a different kind of space. Not a castle, not a workshop, not a palace, a cathedral, not made of stone, but of silence. A place where nothing is spoken, yet everything is heard, because silence, too, is a kind of rule. It is the oldest rule, the one that existed before words, before chairs, before the first note of the first violin, and it is the rule that we have, perhaps, forgotten how to follow. Think of the medieval guest who learned to stop speaking. He did not fall silent because he had nothing to say. He fell silent because he learned that silence was safer. In the great hall, words were weapons. A misplaced comment could ruin a reputation. A joke told at the wrong time could end a career. The guest who spoke too much was not seen as confident. He was seen as dangerous. So he learned to wait, to listen, to exist in the quiet spaces between conversations. That silence was not emptiness. It was strategy. It was survival. And in a strange way, it was also freedom. Because once he stopped trying to fill every gap, he began to notice things. The way the Lord glanced at the servant. The way the lady's hand hesitated before reaching for the wine. The way the firelight shifted across the tapestries, revealing threads of gold that had been invisible in the brightness of the day. Silence gave him eyes. It gave him attention. And attention, as we have seen, is the most dengue thing in any world. The violin, too, knows about silence. It is, after all, an instrument that produces sound from stillness. The bow rests on the string. The hand hovers. The breath slows. And then, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, the note begins. Not from nothing, but from the edge of nothing. The silence is not the absence of music. It is the ground from which music grows. A violinist who does not understand silence cannot understand the violin. Because the most beautiful notes are the ones that emerge from quiet, that are shaped by the pause before them, that carry in them the memory of the hush that preceded their birth. The great performers know this. The great performers know this. They do not rush. They do not fill every moment with sound. They leave spaces. They let the silence speak. And in those spaces, the audience leans forward. The heart opens. The music becomes something more than notes. It becomes presence. The Minoans, too, left silences. Their palaces have no written records we can read. Their myths were not written down until centuries after the civilization had faded. Their rituals are preserved only in images, not explanations. They did not tell us what the bull leaping meant. They did not explain the double axe or the snake goddess. They left us to wonder, and that wondering is a kind of silence. It is the space where interpretation lives, because if they had written everything down, if they had explained every symbol, there would be nothing left for us to discover. The mystery would be dead. But because they left silences, the Minoans are still alive. We are still asking questions, still imagining, still trying to hear what they did not say. That is the power of silence. It does not close doors, it opens them. Now, let us consider attention. We have mentioned it before, but it deserves its own space, because attention is the bridge between silence and meaning. Without attention, silence is just emptiness. With attention, silence becomes a cathedral. Think of the medieval guest again. He learned to watch. He noticed the smallest gestures, the slightest shifts in tone, the almost invisible signals that told him where to stand, when to speak, how to move. That was attention. And it saved him, not because he was smarter than anyone else, but because he was more present. He was not thinking about what he would say next. He was not rehearsing his excuses. He was there in the room, with his eyes open and his mind quiet. That is the kind of attention that the violin demands. 2. When you play, you cannot be thinking about tomorrow. You cannot be worrying about the mistake you made 3 measures ago. You have to be in this note, this bow stroke, this breath. The violin forces you to be present. It punishes distraction. It rewards stillness, and in that way, it is a kind of meditation. Not the meditation of sitting on a cushion, but the meditation of doing one thing with your whole being. The Minoans, we imagine, had their own head, had their own arms of attention. The bull leaping was not something you could do while thinking about the harvest. You had to be completely there in the moment, with the horns and the hooves and the heartbeat. One moment of distraction, and you were dead. That is the edge that attention gives you. It is not comfortable. It is not relaxing. It is alive. And that aliveness is what the frescoes capture. The figures are not stiff. They are not posed. They are moving, twisting, leaping, twisting, leaping. They are fully present in the action. That is why they still feel vibrant, even after thousands of years. Because attention does not age. It is the one thing that remains fresh, no matter how much time passes. But attention is fragile. It is easily broken. The medieval guest, for all his vigilance, could still make a mistake. The violinist, for all his practice, could still miss a note. The Minoan bull leaper, for all his skill, could still fall. That is the risk of being present. You are exposed. You cannot hide behind plans or excuses. You are right there in the moment, and the moment will judge you. That is why so many people avoid attention. They prefer distraction. They prefer to be half present, half somewhere else, because it is safer. If you are not fully there, you cannot be fully hurt. But you also cannot be fully hurt. The castle guest who hid in the shadows, who never spoke, who never risked being noticed, was safe. But he was also invisible. He existed, but he did not live. The violinist who played without feeling, who went through the motions, who produced the notes, but not the emotion, was safe. But no one remembered his performance. The Minoan who stayed in the palace, who never danced with the bull, who never risked the leap, was safe. But he was not in the fresco. He was not remembered. So attention is a gamble. You wager your comfort for a chance at meaning, and sometimes you lose. But sometimes you win. And when you win, you create something that lasts. A moment of music that echoes through centuries. An image that still moves people, though the painter is dust. A memory that your great-grandchildren will carry, though they never knew you. That is the payoff. That is why attention matters. Now, let us turn to impermanence. It is the shadow that follows all the stories we have told. The castle walls will crumble. The violin will warp and crack. The frescoes will fade. The palaces will empty. Even the greatest achievements, the most beautiful objects, the most profound insights will eventually be lost. That is the nature of time. It does not ask permission. It does not make exceptions. It takes everything, eventually. But here is the strange thing. Impermanence is not the enemy of meaning. It is the source of meaning. Because if things lasted forever, they would not matter. The violin that will someday crack is precious, precisely because it will not last. The fresco that will fade is beautiful, precisely because it is fragile. The castle that will crumble is impressive precisely because it took effort to build, and effort implies the possibility of failure. We do not value what is easy. We value what is hard. We do not treasure what is permanent. We treasure what is fleeting. Think of the medieval feast. The food was eaten, the wine was drunk, the fire burned down to ash, but the memory of that night, the laughter, the stories, the warmth, lasted. Not forever, but long enough. The violinist's performance ended. The last note faded into silence, but the feeling it left behind, the hush in the hall, the tears in the eyes of a stranger, that lasted, not forever, but long enough. The Minoan civilization fell. The palaces emptied. The language was forgotten. But the image of the bull leaper, frozen in fresco, lasted. Not forever, but long enough. And long enough is all we have. That is the quiet lesson of impermanence. It is not a tragedy. It is a gift. It reminds us to pay attention, because this moment will not come again. It reminds us to care, because what we do matters, even if only for a while. It reminds us to let go, because holding on too tightly only makes the loss more painful. The medieval guest who could not accept his place suffered. The violinist who could not accept a missed note suffered. The Minoans who could not accept the changing sea suffered. Acceptance is not resignation. It is the recognition that some things are beyond our control. And that recognition is the beginning of wisdom. Now, let us bring these threads together. The castle taught us about rules, both visible and invisible. The violin taught us about craftsmanship, about the slow accumulation of skill that turns wood into voice. The Minoans taught us about mystery, about the power of what is left unsaid, and together they teach us about something else, the beauty of limits. Because a castle without walls is not a castle. A violin without a shape is not a violin. A civilization without boundaries is not a civilization. Limits are not restrictions. Limits are not restrictions. They are definitions. They tell us what something is, and by doing so, they also tell us what it is not. The medieval hierarchy was a limit. It told people where they could sit, when they could speak, how they could move. That limit was frustrating, even oppressive. But it also gave the castle its order. Without it, the great hall would have been chaos. The violin has limits. It can only play certain notes. It can only produce certain sounds. It can only produce certain sounds. Those limits are not failures. They are the conditions of its existence. A violin that could play every possible sound would not be a violin. It would be a noise machine. The Minoans had limits too. They could not control the sea. They could not produce it, vent the eruption. Those limits were not weaknesses. They were the context in which Minoan culture flourished. The bull-leaping ritual, the frescoes, the palaces without walls, all of them existed within the awareness that the sea could turn against them at any moment. That awareness gave their art its urgency, its vibrancy, its life. So do not fear limits. Do not resent the rules that shape your world. They are not there to trap you. They are there to define the space in which you can create. The medieval guest who learned to navigate the hierarchy did not become a slave. He became a strategist. The violinist who learned to work within the instrument's constraints did not become limited. He became a master. The Minoans who accepted the sea's power did not become passive. They became attentive. And attention, as we have seen, is the key to everything. As this long journey ends, let us return to the Cathedral of Silence. Not a building, but a state of being. The place where the noise stops, where the questions pause, where the need to understand gives way to the simple act of listening. In that cathedral, there are no rules. There is no hierarchy. There is no craftsmanship, no mystery, no urgency. There is only the quiet hum of existence, the soft breath of being alive. And in that silence, all the stories we have told come together. The medieval guest finally at peace, no longer worrying about where to sit. The violinist, bow at rest, the last note still vibrating in the air. The Minoan priestess, standing in a sunlit courtyard, watching the bull leapers, not afraid. They are all here, in this silence, because silence is where time stops. It is where the past and present touch. It is where you can feel the weight of centuries without being crushed by it. You do not need to understand everything. You do not need to remember every detail. You only need to be here, now, with your eyes open and your mind quiet. That is the practice. That is the gift. That is what the castle, the violin, and the labyrinth have been trying to teach us all along. Not how to survive, but how to be present. Not how to master, but how to listen. Not how to build something that lasts forever, but how to love something that will not. So as you close your eyes tonight, let the last image be not of a castle, or a violin, or a palace, but of a room. A quiet room. A room with a single candle. And in that room, there is a chair. Not a throne, not a high seat, just a simple chair. And in that chair there is you. Not the you who worries about tomorrow, not the you who rehearses conversations, not the you who rehearses conversations, not the you who checks your phone every few minutes. Just you, breathing, resting. Being, that is the center, that is the source, that is where all the stories begin and end. The medieval guest, the Cremonese luthier, the Minoan bull leaper, they were all, in their own way, trying to return to that room. They were trying to find a moment of stillness in a world that never stopped moving. They did not always succeed. Neither will you. But the trying is the point. The attention is the point. The silence is the point. The silence is the point. Everything else is decoration. Good night, dear friend. Sleep deeply. Sleep without dreams, or with dreams that comfort. And when you wake, remember that you are part of something ancient and something new, something fragile and something enduring. You are the guest, the luthier, the bull leaper. You are the silence between the notes. You are the light on the fresco. You are the breath in the cathedral. Rest now. Let the world spin without you for a while. It will still be there when you return. And you will return, not as the same person who closed their eyes, but as someone who has traveled through centuries and learned to listen. That is the only legacy that matters. Not what you build, but how you pay attention. Not what you achieve, but how you rest. Not what you say, but what you hear in the silence. Good night and rest.